now for our Friday Making a Difference report and the story of a man whose capacity for forgiveness is astonishing. He suffered the worst loss a parent can ever face, and yet he decided to turn his grief into something positive for himself and a troubled young man. Here's NBC's John Larson.
A documentary began the story like this.
14-year-old Tony Hicks shot and killed 20-year-old Tariq Khamisa.
A 14-year-old murders a promising young college student for the cost of a pizza and becomes the youngest child in California history charged as an adult with murder and gets life in prison.
It was like a nuclear bomb going off in my heart.
Azim Khamisa, the father of the victim, buried his only son Tariq according to their Muslim custom. He climbed down into the muddy grave. It had been raining, and they lowered his son's body wrapped in a white cloth down into his open arms.
Yeah, I didn't want to live there alone. I stayed there a long time. When something bad happens, you can stop that bad from happening to other people.
But when he finally came up, he did something remarkable.
It is wrong to lie, to cheat.
First, he forgave the family of the killer.
It was a defining moment in my life.
Only through that forgiveness,
which in turn helped Azim start the Tariq Khamisa Foundation, speaking together to more than 1 million children about the real pain of violence.
And sometimes it scars the soul forever.
Then, Azim visited Tony Hicks, the killer, who had never had a father, and forgave him too.
His forgiveness wasn't something I expected.
Now Azim is lobbying to have Tony released from prison early, like he was his own son. And when he gets out of prison, what do you hope for him?
We'll have a job for him at the foundation.
So you're going to hire him?
Absolutely.
This is the killer of your son?
Yes.
Tony says now he knows what a real father is.
I had a man forgive me for taking the life of his son.
And he will work for that father, and for many who maybe never had fathers, someday, whether he gets out early or not. John Larson, NBC News, San Diego, California.
This is Lisa Ray, president of Restorative Justice International. RJI is happy to be co-sponsoring this conference with ICFA Law School, the Center for Excellence in Criminal Law in India. Today's podcast presentation is co-hosted with my colleague, Dr. Upneet Lalli, Deputy Director of the Institute of Correctional Administration in Kandahar, India, and she's a member of RJI's Global Advisory Council. Our special guest is Azim Khamisa from San Diego, California. Azim is the father of Tariq Khamisa, who in 1995, at the age of 20, was killed by a 14-year-old gang member named Tony Hicks. Tony was tried as an adult and sentenced to 25 years in prison. Azim Khamisa reached out to Tony's grandfather in an act of grace, forgiveness, and restorative justice. And from this meeting, the Tariq Khamisa Foundation was born. Welcome, Azim. We're so happy to have you today.
Thank you for having me. Nice to see you, Lisa.
Wonderful. And we've done a recording before, and you've been on other podcasts with RJI. So why don't you tell your story today to our listeners in India?
Sure. As you pointed out, the genesis of my story is very tragic. My son was a student at San Diego State University. He was a good kid. He was a gifted writer and a gifted photographer. He studying to be a journalist and inspired someday to work for National Geographic. He loved to travel, loved cultures, great sense of humor. And his favorite hero was Gandhi, a man of peace. And he worked on weekends as a pizza delivery man while he was at university and was lured to a bogus address by a youth gang. And as you pointed out, Lisa, they gave the right apartment building with the wrong apartment number. And obviously, nobody had ordered the pizzas. He was in his car trying to get away from the scene of the crime and was accosted by 4 youth gang members. 3 of them were 14 years old. And an 18-year-old handed a 9mm handgun in a gang initiation and gave the order to the 14-year-old, bust him bones. and because he fired one round, which was fatal. And Tariq died a couple of minutes later, drowning in his own blood, as you pointed out, at the age of 20. So needless to say, it brought my life to a crashing halt. It was 29 years ago, but still, it never, ever leaves you. There's nothing more complex than losing a child for a parent. I'm sure you can acknowledge that. And, sometimes in deep trauma, you have a spark of clarity. Every saint has suffered the dark night of the soul. And of course, this was the darkest night of my soul. And I couldn't be in my body. The pain was so excruciating. I practiced as a Sufi Muslim, and I started meditating when I was 20. I lost Tariq in my early 40s. And the pain was so unbearable. I had my first out-of-body experience. And I believe in God. I believe I left my body, went into a loving embrace of God. Not sure how long I was gone for, but when the explosion subsided, God sent me back into my body with the wisdom that there are victims at both ends of the gun. I didn't really see the significance of the download. Obviously, it didn't come from my intellect or my loving heart. But somehow, while of course I had compassion for my son, I felt compassion for the young man who killed him. He was 14. I saw him as a victim as well. And, I went through all the emotions, tough calls to his mother, my daughter, my family, and, but I have survived the tragedy. I remember at one time I was suicidal. It was complicated. He was my only son. I do have a daughter, thank God, not my only child. I've met many parents in the last 29 years that have lost an only child. And then 9 months after Tariq died, having learned this horrific statistics, in the US, we lose a young soul like Tariq every hour. It's not even news anymore. And I saw that the enemy wasn't the 14-year-old, rather the peer pressure that forced many young men and women to fall through the crack and then get involved with gangs and crimes and drugs and alcohols and weapons, which happens a lot in the US. And so I started the Tariq Khamisa Foundation with the mandate of stopping kids from killing kids. And we essentially had three major goals. First was to save lives of children because we lose so many. Second was to empower them with the right choices so they don't fall to the crack and get involved with crime and drugs and gangs and alcohol and weapons. And third was to teach the principles of nonviolence, of accountability, of empathy, of compassion, of forgiveness, and of peace building and peacemaking. And I started with a very simple premise that violence is a learned behavior. And if you accept that as a truism, then nonviolence can also be a learned behavior. But you have to teach it. And in America, it shocked me that by the time our kids get to grade 1, they've seen over 100,000 images of violence. Check out the news, the movies, the video games. It's violence, and more violence. So soon after I started it, I reached out to Tony's grandfather, Les Felix, with the attitude that I'm not here screaming retribution and revenge, and I'm not here in anger. Rather, I'm here I'm here with compassion, and because what I really see here, we both lost a son, and I can't bring my son back from the dead. He's gone, and nothing you can do to take Tony out of prison. he was the first 14-year-old in the state of California to be tried as an adult and go to 25 years to life sentence. And I've started this foundation with a very lofty mission. And the real reason I am here is to ask for your help, because this is a lofty mission. I can't do this by myself. And he was very quick to take my hand of forgiveness. And the first thing he said to me, thanks for reaching out to me. I have been in a prayer closet. He's a Baptist from the South and also a very spiritual man. And he said, I've been praying that someday I get a chance to meet you, to extend my condolences to you and your family for your loss. And of course, I'll help you. Well, fast forward, the foundation is also in its 29th year. We reached 2 million kids. The grandfather and I are still together. 5 years after the tragedy, I met the young man who killed my son while he was in prison. He was 19. Stayed with him for 20 plus years after that, more like a fatherly role model. Finally, advocating for his release, finally went into the front of the parole board. And I was at the parole board along with my daughter, who is the executive director of the Tariq Khamisa Foundation, advocating for his release. And even the commissioner was in tears, saying, I've never had the victim's father and sister advocate for the offender's release. I've been doing this work for 25 years. And I said, he's got work to do, not behind bars. We'll hire him at the Tariq Khamisa Foundation. And you can tell he's not the same person as he was when he was 14. He shifted as a result of my forgiveness, and he can save a lot of kids. So release him. Anyone release, which never happens when you go in front of the parole board for the first time.
Right. Let me interject here, because we have a bunch of questions that we want to ask both Upneet and I. And Upneet, why don't you take this now? And I want to delve in a little bit deeper about restorative justice and forgiveness. And if you have questions for Azim, he's already told us quite a bit, but do you want to ask some questions along that line? You're muted.
You're muted.
Yeah, my condolences to you. I mean, we've seen the videos and even the RJI podcast. I've seen that part of it also. It's such a powerful story. And in terms of you reaching out, it's been 29 years. And in that YouTube, also we've seen that now you are planning to have him on board. Normally, we find that, and I guess it's throughout the world, that the violence has increased, especially amongst the youth. And your mission of peaceful world and restorative justice is indeed something that has message in any country of the world. What I would like to ask you, firstly, is that how difficult is it to move from a deterrent approach to a restorative approach? You've had a very spiritual experience that made you see that there were victims on both sides. But it's not easy for everyone, because we have a lot of people, a lot of victims who would ask for, death penalty or the severest of punishments. And people would assume that it would lead to less crime if there were severe punishments. And that's how policies are getting framed and our laws are getting framed. So in that sense, I would like you, since you have met so many victims also, so how does one start, realizing that, yes, the other person, the other offender could also be a victim, and there is scope for restorative justice? And second question is, does that lead to closure?
Yes, let me start with the first one. the reason we have a punitive criminal justice system is because we've inherited it from monarchy. I'm sure India, under the British Raj, brought a lot of that criminal justice.
Yes, yes,
So
yes.
in a monarchy, the king or the queen owns both the land and the people. So when there is a crime, it's always the king or the queen against the offender. In America, we don't have monarchy, neither do you have in India. So the state takes that role. So in my case, it was the state of California against Tony Hicks. Now, RJ has a different attitude. RJ comes from the Aboriginal cultures of New Zealand and Australia. And they say in a crime happens in the context of community. You know, the state can play a facilitator role, but they cannot be a direct party. So in a crime, there are three parties. There's the victim, there's the offender, and then there's community. And justice is not served till the victim has been made whole. Well, you can't bring my son back, but to the extent I can be restored, I believe I have, because now I'm partnering with both the grandfather and the kid who killed my son. So that's the second piece, is you have to bring the offender back into society as a functioning and a contributing member. When a youth offends in the Aboriginal cultures of Australia and New Zealand, the whole village shows up, puts the youth in the middle of a circle and says something positive about him and encourages him to make amends with the victim. And the third piece is you got to heal the community. And this is exactly what we do. The foundation is very active in schools and through the work that we are teaching, which is about empathy, compassion, forgiveness, and peace building, is making a better community. So RJ is a lot better and a more humane and a more compassionate form of justice than the one you inherited from the British Raj, you know, or from monarchy. So I think that this is taking a lot of traction in the United States and other parts of the Western world. Not sure where you are in India. It's not mainstream by any means, Dr. Lalli, but we have to go and make it mainstream, because
Absolutely.
the punitive system is creating more violence. And here's another point. And I do this work in prisons. I've yet to meet an offender who was not a victim. And that is true with Tony. As a child, he was abused. His favorite uncle was shot. He was in South Central Los Angeles. If I had the same life he had, I might would have made the same decision. So if you want to make a shift in the offensive world, you've got to look and say that every offender at some point was a victim as well. So we have to change our lenses. And that's what I think Lisa at RJI International and a lot of other organizations that are involved with restorative justice are trying to change the system.
Yes.
Now,
So
the second question about your closure, yeah, I think that you never, ever get over losing a child. Tariq's birthday was March 6th. His anniversary was January 21st. There are 44 days, except for the leap year, was 45 days between those two incidents. I'm never quite the same, even now. But I do know that something good came out of this very dark tragedy. And that's reassuring that my son's gift to me was put me on my spiritual purpose. I didn't do this when he was alive. I worked in international finance. I've traveled a lot, including I've been to India several times. But we all have a spiritual purpose, and somehow with the grace of God, and my mother was a very spiritual influence in my life, I was able to transcend something very dark and get to a positive place. So this work that I have done in the last 29 years has been extremely fulfilling. I've written 5 books, and I talk a lot about restorative justice. And I do believe that that work is so important, and I'm happy to see that you're having this major conference in Hyderabad.
Wonderful. Let me add on to this, and Upneet mentioned it too, but I want to explore forgiveness. As you know, Azim, so many victims that do know about restorative justice, both nationally and internationally, there are many that support it. That's what RJI has been about, is really organizing victims and reaching out to them, and making sure they know what restorative justice is. When they choose it, however, not all victims are interested in exploring forgiveness, or some might even be repelled by it and saying, I don't want to be forced to forgive. Now, how are you different? How was it different for you?
Yeah,
and how can you help other victims, I guess, too?
Most people don't quite get the meaning of forgiveness because it's not about the offender. It's about you. If you stay in anger or hatred or resentment, who are you hurting? Yourself, right? Mandela didn't write this quote, but he made it famous. He said, unforgiveness is like drinking poison and waiting for your enemy to die. So forgiveness is very much about you. Now, when I first started the foundation in 95, and I wrote my first book in 98, there wasn't much about forgiveness. Today, there are 500 clinical studies on forgiveness. There's a forgiveness project at Stanford. There's a forgiveness project in London, one in Hawaii, that it has been clinically proved that forgiveness is a healthy thing to do for you. And the biggest thing, Lisa, that I teach now is that for you to get to forgiveness, you have to separate yourself from the offender. You have your journey, the offender has his journey or her journey. And even the scriptures tell us, leave judgment and vengeance to me. It's about you. So the point I'm trying to make is that in my case, of course, the offender eventually did ask for my forgiveness and the grandfather was receptive. That doesn't always happen. But the important thing is that you have to move forward. And without forgiving, it's very difficult to move forward. Mandela was asked, why did you forgive your captors after they imprisoned you for 27 years? He says, if I didn't forgive, I'd still be in prison. Right? So the point I'm trying to make is, I do a 2-day forgiveness workshop where I teach 3 milestones how you forgive people that have harmed you, and 3 milestones how you forgive yourselves, because at some level we want to harm. I remember this Jewish lady that was in my course, and on the morning of the second day, she says, Azim, you don't get it. She's very animated. I said, what is it I don't get? I'm working on forgiving Hitler. Pretty heavy. And I looked at her, you could see that she was in hatred because had lost family in the Holocaust. Lines, you could actually, you could feel her hatred in a palpable way. Her energy was so dark and negative. And I said to her, you know what? Let me tell you something. The higher power knows how to deal with Hitler better than you do or I do. And as I speak to you, the higher power is dealing with Hitler. Why do you want Hitler to live in this meager real estate of your psyche? Why don't you let it go so love and joy can live there? And knowing that the higher power is dealing with her. And you know, the light bulb went on by the end of the second day. So I don't know how many hugs she gave me. And a month later, she sent me this beautiful card thanking me for the workshop and says, my husband thanks you. We've been married for 25 years. We now have the most loving relationship because Hitler doesn't live here anymore. Yeah. So once you get the benefits of, freedom and health and if you live in a victim mentality, right? There's no quality. I didn't want to go through life on crutches. That I lost my only son. I had a full life there. Then I have a full life now. This is more important because this is about saving kids. That was about money. So I think that if forgiveness is explained in a way that it is best for you, because at some point, the only way to stop being a victim is you have to forgive. There's no other way. And if you want to, and if you go through life as victim, there are so many examples. O.J. Simpson, if one comes to mind, that he hated O.J. so much. Eventually, he had cancer because it's very corrosive. So all of these emotions like anger and hatred and guilt and shame, create disease in you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think forgiveness is a lesson that we must hold on. And in the programs we do in schools with kids, one thing that I can tell you stories after stories after stories, one thing that we are able to communicate is forgiveness. I just spoke at San Diego State University, and this kid came up to me and says, Mr. Khamisa, you changed my life. And I said, well, tell me more. So when I was in 7th grade, you came and talked to my school. I just graduated at SDSU with a degree in finance. I have a job at Wells Fargo. Because when I met you and when I was in 7th grade, 13 years old, I decided to make you my role model because I know you were in finance. And I didn't follow my older brother, my father, and my grandfather, who were all gang involved. See, his kids will not be in the gang. So there are stories like this that once people understand the gifts of forgiveness, I think they can be more open to it. I mean, I've had, a lot of, most people that go through my workshop, transform and get breakthroughs, like the lady that I told you that lost her family in the Holocaust.
So Azim, let me ask you this, and then we'll go back to Upneet. And Upneet, maybe we can explore retributive justice versus restorative justice, which you touched on. But let me ask you this, Azim, especially for those that are listening in India. Let's talk about Tony Hicks and about what we stress at RJI, which is offender accountability. So when did he take responsibility for what he had done in killing your son? How did that happen?
Yeah, so he was in the bravado for the first 2 years. He was 14, blamed everybody else. Because I started the foundation 9 months after Tariq died, reached out to the grandfather, had forgiven him. And then 2 years later, they couldn't figure out whether he should be tried as a juvenile or as an adult. Finally, they decided to try him as an adult. And at that hearing, the day before, he broke down. And the reason he broke down, because there was a man who helped me start the foundation that interviewed him 22 times between the murder and the time of the hearing. And his grandfather was with him along with a public defender. And he broke down and says, I will do the right thing. At the hearing, he took responsibility. I shot and killed Tariq Khamisa, a person I did not know, who was not doing anything wrong to me. I pray to God that Mr. Khamisa will forgive me for the harm that I've caused him. So it's a good question, Lisa, because sometimes that accountability doesn't happen immediately. I forgave him a long time before he asked for it. But I do believe if your forgiveness is authentic, in other words, sincere, no strings attached, it will shift the other person, as it did with Tony.
Yes,
Then he spent the next 25 years in prison. I met him when he was 19, stayed with him. He's finally out in 2019, 5 years ago, and now he volunteers for the foundation, as I and his grandfather have done for 29 years. He's a plumber, and he, on his off days, he is with us at foundation. I just spoke with him, and we speak at conferences together, and I'm impressed with him. He's 43 years old, and he's better at technology than I am. And you would never know. He spent 25 years in prison. He's a very good demeanor, and he's just passionate about saving kids and not follow his former footsteps. I mean, I truly believe there's a lot of resources in our prison.
Yes.
We have the world's largest prison population. We have 4% of the world's population, 25% of the world's prison population. But I've done a lot of work in prisons, and like Tony, there are other that can create a better society.
And so, Upneet, do you want to lead a discussion on retributive versus restorative from the context of India?
Yeah, sure. Azim has been very right that, yes, we also have this, colonial system that we inherited in terms of our penal code and punishments. We've just had recent amendments, in fact, in December, of the criminal laws. So supposedly they are supposed to be focusing on like less of the colonial part. One alternative that has been added is in terms of a community sentence, but that's for minor offenses. But the severe, I mean, it remains largely the similar to what was the Indian Penal Code of 1860. In terms of both the public and the polity, I think the easier part anytime to deal with crime is that you come out with more deterrent and harsher punishments and a retributive policy. It's a lot less because the other things are more time consuming. And in order to bring about a peaceful community and a peaceful society, we need to do a lot of work in terms of, so that there is less violence. And what I find, which is something of concern, even particularly in the north of India, is in terms of the spread of drugs and gangs. So we may be behind in certain ways, but yes, we are catching up in a wrong way in that sense. And prevention of crime and in terms of its relation to what happens in the prison, you're so very right, because I also meet so many prisoners across the country, and everybody has that disillusion with justice. So both the offender and the victims are not happy with what they perceive, what they get as delivered as justice. So even there is a lot of denial on the part of offenders who have been sentenced by the court. So for the victims who may feel that, okay, this man is inside, but even after being inside, there is no realization that what I have done. There's a lot of denial. There's no accountability. So in that sense, retribution does not promote accountability. So in terms of when we are to push for that change, either it cannot come from the political setup. It has to be initiated from the community level. We don't have an organization of victims as such in our country. And that's where I feel, that the victims' voices really don't get heard when policies are being made and when laws are being framed. Because everybody assumes that, yes, every victim wants the offender to be punished severely. So the retribution from the media side and the others, that gets more brownie points. Whereas in terms of restorative justice, which is a work in progress, people haven't heard much about it. It's something that's supposed to be more, idealistic, which may not really work. So and I think these stories, that's so very important. And that's why this conference as well, hopefully will help to remove those, myths about this being something that's only in movies it happens, it cannot be really promoted as such. Right. So that part of the thing is we need to educate the public. And I think that's so important, of all these organizations around the world and me being a part of it, that we need to talk in terms changing the lens, from a retributive approach to a restorative approach.
Right.
But how can it be really, is it something that we, to begin with in our country, could there be lessons that could be learned in terms of how to build up that movement?
Yes. So the other part of RJ is that this victim offender reconciliation is an important effort. It has to be done at the community level. But there are programs. Like I speak at 5 federal prisons. And there's a program called LCP, which is called Life Connection Program. It's a spiritual program. It is run by the chaplain of the prison. It is offered to all the incarcerated individuals. We don't call them inmates anymore. We call them incarcerated individuals that are going to be paroled in 3 to 5 years. I typically speak in the front end of every cohort because the chaplain says once they hear your story, they pay attention to the 18-month program. So every incarcerated individual has a spiritual teacher. If you are Hindu, You have a monk. If you are Christian, you have a minister. If you're a Muslim, you have an imam. If you're Jewish, you have a rabbi. And if you are none of that, you have a spiritual teacher. And they work with the offender during this 18 months. Now, here's the results. The recidivism rate in the adult system is 2/3. But if they go through the LCP program, it drops to 17%, which is an amazing result. And it doesn't mean that the other 83% are sitting on their couch doing nothing. They are actively involved in the community, just like Tony is, to make it a better community, because there are societal ills in every community. So it is important to understand that this work that has to be done with offenders, we can turn them from being offenders to being resources. The same thing is true with victims, because one of the things we talk about, that I talk about when I go to prison, is, take responsibility for your actions. Most offenders will try to point their finger to somebody else. Ask forgiveness of the people you harmed. Even if it is not granted, the right thing to do is to ask for it. 3, redeem yourself. No more of this behavior. And redemption also means not only do you ask for forgiveness, you change your behavior forever and you help others not to follow in your former footsteps.
Right.
And that will help you forgive yourselves. Yeah.
Wonderful. Wonderful. We're going to have to watch our time here, but let me just add this and then I'll have you close, Azim. RJI does support a right to restorative justice for every victim. And we think that should be in our laws, both in the United States and around the world, so that victims have access to restorative justice, which often they don't even know exists. So that's something that we work on. Let's just close now, Azim, and give kind of a conclusion to this very short interview with Upneet and myself.
Sure. No, I think what you're doing is great, Lisa, and what you're doing in India is wonderful to see. And I'm happy to support you in any way I can. As I've written 5 books, I've written a lot about RJ. It is the more humane and the compassionate way to go. And I think it starts with accountability. It starts with empathy. It starts with compassion. It starts with forgiveness. One of my books is about a quote I wrote, and I think I'll close with that sustained goodwill creates friendship, as evidenced by my friendship with the grandfather and now with Tony. But sustained goodwill creates friendship. Sustained friendship creates trust. Sustained trust creates respect. Sustained respect creates empathy. Sustained empathy creates compassion, which makes forgiveness possible, which creates peace. So I call this my peace formula. So it starts with goodwill, friendship, trust, respect, empathy, compassion, and forgiveness. So hopefully this message can help others at your conferences to espouse these valuable attributes. It has worked for me, and I believe it can work for them. It can work for India. It can work for the USA. It can work for the world. Thank you for having me.
Good. Thank you so much for telling your story, Azim. You're such a witness to the world. And that's why this conference was happening in India as RJI as a co-sponsor. So thank you. And thank you, Dr. Lalli, for co-hosting this event today. And this is good. Thank you so much. And this is Lisa. And remember, folks, that as we put this up on our website too, we'll make sure to have a link to the foundation, to the Khamisa Foundation, where Azim and Tony and others work. So thank you so much.
You're very welcome, Lisa. I wish you.
Thank you so much, Azim. Thank you so much. And India is the country of Ahimsa, and where all the religions of the world have sprouted from Hinduism to Jainism and Buddhism and Sikhism, and Sufi. So yes.
No, I'm thinking that India is such a spiritual place that RJ may take off and flourish. We may learn more from you in a few more years than the other way.
And we'll do this all together. Thank you so much.
Yes, we're all together. Thank you.
Good. And this is Lisa Ray for RJI. Good evening.
Good evening.